The day I came home from the hospital with my daughter, I had 2 grocery bags, a diaper bag, and a broken wrist that hadn't fully healed. My husband wasn't there. My mother wasn't there. I stood in the parking lot of St. Michael's in Toronto, in February, in the kind of cold that gets inside your coat and stays. And I called my sister because I didn't know who else to call. She didn't answer. I want you to understand something before I keep going. I was 31 years old. I had a good job. I was a paralegal at a firm downtown. I'd worked there for 6 years. I knew what I was doing with my life. I wasn't some lost kid who needed rescuing. I had a husband, a nice apartment in Etobicoke, a savings account, a plan. I thought I had a family. It took 1 car accident and 1 baby to show me exactly what I actually had. The accident happened in October, 3 weeks before my due date. I was driving back from a prenatal appointment on the Gardner when a truck merged without looking and pushed me into the guardrail. The baby was fine. That was the first thing they told me. The baby is fine. And I remember crying in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child, just completely undone with relief. I had a fractured wrist, 2 cracked ribs, and whiplash bad enough that I couldn't turn my head to the left without pain shooting all the way down to my shoulder. But the baby was fine. My husband, I'll call him my husband because I can't make myself say his name anymore without feeling sick, showed up at the hospital 2 hours later. He'd been in a meeting. He said it like that, just matter of fact, like I should understand that meetings happen, that these things come up. He sat beside me for 40 minutes, answered 2 emails on his phone while I was getting x-rays, and then said he needed to get back. He had a dinner with a client. I told myself it was stress, but he was scared and didn't know how to show it. I made a lot of excuses like that in the years we were married. My parents came the next morning. My mother brought a casserole from the Lebanese place on Bloor that I'd loved since I was a kid, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought everything was going to be okay. She sat at the foot of my bed and held my good hand and told me I'd been so strong, and I believed her. I thought the accident had cracked something open between us, something that would let us be closer. What she actually said, when she thought I was drifting off to sleep, was this: she needs to sign the papers before the baby comes. Once there's a child in the picture, everything gets complicated. I wasn't asleep. I didn't say anything. I lay there with my eyes closed and my heart going very fast, and I listened to her say, quietly to my father, "The timing is terrible. But we can't wait." I didn't know what papers she meant. Not yet. My daughter was born on November 3rd. Labor was fast and chaotic, and my wrist was still in a brace, which made everything harder, and my husband held my hand through it and seemed genuinely moved when she arrived, this tiny, furious, perfect person who screamed like she was already annoyed at the world. He cried. I cried. For about 4 hours I thought we were going to be okay, all 3 of us. Then his mother called, and he stepped out into the hallway, and came back 15 minutes later with a different face. I named my daughter Iris. She had a full head of dark hair and my grandmother's nose, and when they laid her on my chest, she looked up at me like she was taking inventory. Like, she was deciding whether I was worth the trouble. I decided right then that I would spend the rest of my life making sure she never doubted it. My parents visited the next day. My mother held Iris for about 10 minutes, which appreciated, but the whole time she kept looking at my husband with something I can only describe as anxious. Like they were waiting for something. Like there was an agenda underneath the visit, and the casseroles and the flowers. My father barely touched the baby. He sat in the chair by the window and scrolled through his phone and said, mostly to himself, "You'll need to figure out childcare right away. You can't expect people to just rearrange their lives." I asked him what he meant. He looked at my husband. My husband looked at the floor. "We talked about this," my mother said. "We're not in a position to help with the baby. We have our own lives. You knew this." I hadn't known this. I want to be very clear. No one had said this to me. Not once. Not during the 9 months of my pregnancy. Not during the accident. Not during the 3 days I'd spent in the hospital. No one had said, "You're on your own with this child." "I'm not asking you to move in," I said. "I'm asking if someone can be with me the first week. My wrist isn't healed. I can't drive. I can barely." "You have a husband," my mother said. My husband was looking at his phone. I came home from the hospital on a Thursday. My mother did not come. My husband carried the car seat up to the apartment, put it on the kitchen table, and told me he had to go into the office for a few hours. He'd be back by dinner. He kissed me on the forehead like I was as a child being dropped off at school. He didn't come back by dinner. He came back at 11:30 and smelled like a restaurant I didn't recognize. The first 2 weeks I ran on no sleep, 1 functional wrist, and a stubbornness I didn't know I had. I learned to change diapers left-handed. I learned to breastfeed with a cracked rib, which I do not recommend. I ordered groceries online because I couldn't carry bags, and when the delivery came, I'd prop the door open with my foot and drag everything inside one item at a time. My downstairs neighbor, an older Jamaican woman named Mrs. Allen, started leaving food outside my door. Soup, mostly biscuits sometimes. She never knocked. She just left things and went back downstairs, and I would find them and eat them in the dark while Iris slept, and I would think, this woman barely knows me and she is kinder to me than my own mother. I tried not to think too hard about what that meant. My husband and I barely spoke. He worked long hours, or said he did, and when he was home he was elsewhere, distracted, half present. He'd hold Iris sometimes and seem genuinely tender with her, and those moments confused me more than the absences did, because how do you hold a baby like that and still be whatever he was being? I started sleeping with my phone next to me, because I was afraid something would happen in the night, and I'd have no one to call. My maternal grandfather had been living alone in Mississauga since my grandmother passed 2 years earlier. He was 80 years old and stubborn about it, refused to move closer to anyone or consider any kind of assisted living situation. He had a house he'd bought in the 70s, a garden he tended every summer, a library of paperback mysteries he'd been working through for decades. He called me every Sunday without fail. When I was a child, he was the person I went to when things were bad. Not because he gave advice, he almost never did, but because he listened in a way that made you feel like what you were saying actually mattered. He had this way of being completely still when you talked, like there was nowhere else he needed to be. He called me the week after I came home from the hospital, and I answered and just started crying before I even said hello. I couldn't help it. I was exhausted and alone, and I'd been holding everything together so tightly that the sound of his voice just broke something loose. He said, "I'm coming over tomorrow." I said he didn't have to. He said, "I'm coming over tomorrow." He showed up at 9 in the morning with a duffel bag and a pot of Lebanese lentil soup he'd made at 6 a.m. and driven over in the passenger seat because he didn't trust the lid. He was 80 years old and he had taken the QEW from Mississauga at rush hour with a pot of soup. And when I opened the door and saw him standing there, I genuinely did not know how to speak for a moment. He stayed for 3 weeks. It was my grandfather who first said it out loud. We were sitting at my kitchen table one evening, Iris asleep in the next room, and he looked at me over his tea and said, "Something is wrong here, not just with your husband. Something else." I told him about the conversation I'd overheard in the hospital. The papers. My mother's voice, low and careful, saying the timing was terrible, but they couldn't wait. He went very still. "Your grandmother's estate," he said finally. "Did your parents ever talk to you about it?" I said no. I knew my grandmother had left me something. A small inheritance, nothing dramatic. She'd mentioned it once or twice over the years, but I hadn't thought about it since the accident. I'd had other things on my mind. My grandfather set down his tea. "There was a property," he said. "Your grandmother's family had a cottage property in Muskoka. She inherited it from her parents. When she passed, she left it to you directly." I stared at him. "She didn't trust your parents to hold it," he said simply. "She knew how they were, she loved them, but she knew. The property went directly to you, in the will, no conditions." "Then why would my parents?" "Because they've been using it," he said, "for the past 2 years, renting it out. Short-term rentals, Airbnb. I don't know the details, but your uncle mentioned something last Christmas and I didn't understand what he meant at the time. I think I do now." The room felt very quiet. "They've been collecting rental income," I said slowly, "on a property that belongs to me." "Without telling you it existed," he said. I thought about my mother sitting at the foot of my hospital bed. She needs to sign the papers before the baby comes. Once there's a child in the picture, everything gets complicated. They weren't worried about the baby making things complicated. They were worried about the baby making me complicated. Harder to manage, more protective of what was mine, less likely to sign anything without reading it first. I'm a paralegal. I want to be very clear about this part. I know what a will looks like. I know what a property transfer looks like. I know exactly what documentation you'd need to quietly redirect rental income from a Muskoka cottage you don't own. I called my colleague Amara the next morning. She does estate law, and I told her everything. She was quiet for a long time. "How long ago did your grandmother pass?" she asked. 2 years, I said. "And no one has contacted you about the property?" "No one. And you have no idea if any transfers have been attempted?" I said I didn't. She told me not to sign anything, not to answer any calls from numbers I didn't recognize, and to come into the office when I could. My grandfather drove me. Iris was 3 weeks old and slept the whole way there in her car seat, and I sat in the front and looked out at the gray November highway and felt something settle in me. Not calm, exactly, but resolution. The kind of feeling where you stop being afraid and start being focused. Amara pulled the property records within the hour. The cottage in Muskoka, 4 bedrooms, waterfront, inherited from my great-grandparents, assessed at well over $900,000, was registered in my name, exactly as my grandfather had said. There had been 2 attempts to file a transfer of ownership in the past 18 months. Both had been flagged and suspended, because they lacked my signature. Someone had tried twice to transfer my property without my knowledge. We also found records of rental income. 14 months of short-term rental listings, all pointing back to an account that had been set up in my grandmother's name. Amara looked at me across the desk. Iris made a small sound in her carrier, and then went quiet again. "Do you want to know who filed the transfer attempts?" she said. I said yes. She turned her monitor toward me. "My parents' names. And my husband's. I didn't call them. I know it might seem like that's the first thing you'd do, but I've worked in legal for 6 years and I know that you don't make calls you can't take back before you know what you're doing." I went home with my grandfather, and I sat at the kitchen table and I thought it through. My husband had known about the property. He had access to my grandmother's estate documents. He'd been there when the lawyer called, 2 years ago. I'd assumed it was a routine notification and I'd let him take the message because Iris hadn't been sleeping well and I was managing everything on my own. I had let him take the message. I thought about all the evenings he'd worked late in the past 2 years. The dinner with the client in October. His mother's call at the hospital. The way he'd looked at my mother in the delivery room. I thought about my brakes. The accident on the Gardner, the truck that merged without looking, had been investigated as a standard collision. No charges, insufficient evidence, but my car had been serviced 2 weeks before. My husband had taken it in because I'd been exhausted and he'd offered, and I'd been grateful because I was 8 months pregnant, and even small kindnesses felt enormous by that point. I called Amara from my kitchen table while my grandfather washed dishes and pretended not to listen. I told her about the service appointment. She told me to call the police. I want to tell you the next part was easy. It wasn't. Calling the police and saying, "I think my husband may have tampered with my brakes," is one of the hardest sentences I've ever said out loud. I felt insane saying it. I felt like I was watching myself from outside my body, like this couldn't be my actual life. The detective I spoke to was a woman. She was patient, and she didn't make me feel stupid. She took notes on everything: the property, the transfer attempts, the rental income, the service appointment, the timing of my husband's calls in the hospital. She said she couldn't tell me where the investigation would go, but she said the circumstantial picture was, and I remember her exact word, concerning. My husband was served papers 3 days later. He called me from outside the apartment. He hadn't come back since I'd stopped answering his texts, and I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that was mostly silence and then just the word okay, and then he hung up. My parents called the same afternoon. My mother cried. She told me I was misunderstanding things, that they'd been managing the property on my behalf, that they'd been meaning to talk to me about it when the timing was better. She used the word timing 3 times in 4 minutes. I said, "You went to a lawyer twice to transfer ownership of my property into your name. I have the documents." She didn't say anything for a long time. "Everything I've ever done has been for you." "I know," I said. And I meant it, in a way. I think she believed that. I think people can believe things about themselves that have almost nothing to do with the truth of what they've actually done. I hung up. My grandfather stayed until January. Every morning he made coffee and oatmeal and sat at the table, reading the paper while Iris slept. And then, when she woke up, he'd hold her and talk to her, in the mix of English and Arabic that was just how he spoke when he was comfortable, and she would look at him with this absolute concentration, like she was memorizing him. I started seeing a therapist in December. She works out of an office on Bloor, and she has a small succulent on her windowsill that I found oddly reassuring. In our first session, she asked me what I needed most right now, and I said I needed to stop being surprised. I needed to understand how I'd missed all of this for so long. She said that was a good place to start. The investigation into the brake tampering was eventually closed without charges. There wasn't enough evidence. The car had been in the shop. Multiple people had access. The timing was circumstantial. I'll never know for certain. I've had to make a kind of peace with not knowing, which is its own kind of work. What I do know, my husband was charged with 2 counts of fraud related to the attempted property transfers and the misappropriation of rental income. My parents are facing civil liability. My lawyer, a real one now for my own case, says the property will be fully secured in my name within the year. The cottage in Muskoka has a dock that goes out over the water, and a screen porch where my grandmother used to read in the evenings, and I have looked at photos of it so many times in the past few months that I feel like I already know it. Iris and I are going up this summer. My grandfather says he'll come too if his knees cooperate. I told him they'd better. Mrs. Allen knocked on my door in January, the day after my grandfather went home. She had a container of rice and peas and a look on her face that suggested she already knew more about my situation than I'd told her. She sat at my kitchen table and held Iris on her lap and told me that when her own husband left 30 years ago, she'd had nothing. No savings, no family nearby, just a 6-year-old and a second-floor apartment in Scarborough. But I had myself, she said, and I had my sense. And that was enough to start. Iris grabbed her finger and held on. I'm not going to tell you I figured everything out. I'm 32 now. I'm a single mother in a city where childcare costs more per month than my first apartment did. I work 4 days a week, and I call my therapist on Thursdays, and I make my grandfather's lentil soup every other weekend, and eat it watching something bad on television and feel, genuinely, like this is my life and I am in it. That took longer than you'd think to feel. Some Sundays I drive out to Mississauga and sit in my grandfather's kitchen while he makes tea, and we don't talk about any of it. Not my parents, not the case, not the years I spent in a marriage that was built on something I still don't fully understand. We talk about what Iris did that week, and his garden, and the mystery novel he's reading, and outside the window the February light is thin and cold and entirely beautiful, and I think, I almost miss this. I almost let them take this from me. Iris is 4 months old now. She is the most opinionated person I have ever met, which I believe she gets from me, and from my grandfather, and from the long line of stubborn women before me, who kept going, even when the people who should have helped them didn't. She's going to know all their names.